There is a question so basic, so embarrassingly obvious, that almost nobody stops to actually ask it. Why do humans wear clothes? Not how we learned to sew. Not when fabrics became sophisticated. But why? Why did any of this start in the first place? You probably have an answer ready. Warmth, survival, modesty, those feel right, they sound logical. And they are almost entirely wrong, because when scientists actually went looking for the real origin of human clothing, digging through fossils, running genetic tests, studying parasites and archaeology, what they found was something that had almost nothing to do with temperature. It had everything to do with the human mind. Specifically, the moment our ancestors became aware that other people could see them. And once you understand that, you'll never look at getting dressed the same way again. Let's start with a problem. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, anatomically identical to us, have existed for somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 years. That's a long time, long enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall thousands of times over. But here's what's interesting. When researchers traced the physical evidence of clothing, bone needles, hide processing tools, those artifacts don't show up until around 75,000 to 120,000 years ago. Do the math. That means for at least half of human existence, possibly more, our ancestors walked around with no clothing at all. Not occasionally, consistently, as a species. And these weren't primitive creatures stumbling around in the dark. These were fully modern humans. Same brain size as yours, same cognitive capacity, same emotional architecture. Just no shirt. Now, if clothing began because of cold, that gap is very hard to explain. Because during the period when we weren't wearing anything, many of our ancestors were living in the same warm African environments we can trace through the fossil record. They weren't migrating into the Arctic. The cold climate argument requires us to believe that humans lived for hundreds of thousands of years in conditions that sometimes dropped to frigid temperatures at night and somehow never thought to grab an animal skin. That strains believability. So researchers started looking elsewhere. In 2003, a group of geneticists published a paper that quietly reframed the entire conversation around clothing origins. They weren't studying bones, they weren't studying tools. They were studying lice. Specifically, they were studying the genetic divergence between two types of lice that affect humans. Head lice, which have existed alongside humans for millions of years, living in hair, and body lice, a separate species, which live exclusively in fabric, not on skin, not in hair, in clothing. Body lice cannot survive without fabric. They needed to lay eggs to feed to complete their life cycle, which means body lice could not have evolved until humans were wearing clothes consistently enough for an entirely new organism to develop a dependency on it. So the scientists did something clever. They traced back the genetic split between the two species, the point where one type of louse became two. That split, they calculated, happened roughly 170,000 years ago. 170,000 years ago, humans were already wearing clothes consistently enough that a parasite evolved to specialize in living inside those clothes. This is now the oldest biological timestamp we have for human clothing. Not a tool, not a needle, a parasite. Because sometimes the most uncomfortable things reveal the most useful truths. But even this doesn't explain the why. It just tells us clothing was already an established habit by that point. The origin is older and stranger. Here's another clue that the practical protection theory breaks down under pressure. If you were designing clothing purely to protect a body from physical harm, thorns, rocks, rough terrain, biting, insects, where would you start? Logically, the feet, the hands, the forearms, the places that actually make contact with the environment during daily movement. But that's not what early clothing protected. In almost every ancient culture that researchers have studied, the earliest garments covered the torso and the groin, the areas least likely to brush against the thorn, the areas most central to the body's interior. These aren't the parts taking damage on a daily hunt. They're the parts closest to the core of the self. Why would early humans prioritize covering those areas first? That question sat unanswered for a long time, until researchers started considering an entirely different kind of explanation, one that wasn't about the body at all, one that was about the mind. Around 70,000 years ago, something dramatic happened in human behavior. We call it the cognitive revolution. Cave art appeared, complex tools multiplied rapidly, trade networks formed between groups that had never met. Symbols started showing up, carved into bone, pressed into clay. Humans began doing things that required not just intelligence but imagination. This wasn't a physical change. Their skulls looked the same before and after. What shifted was internal, something in how the mind was organizing information. And clothing is deeply connected to that shift. Here's why. To make clothing, real intentional clothing, not just draping a leaf over your shoulders, you have to perform a specific kind of mental act that is uniquely human. You look at a raw animal hide. It's stiff, smelly, nothing like a garment. And you have to imagine it as something it doesn't yet exist as. You picture it on your body. You plan the steps to get it there, you execute those steps across hours or days, holding the goal in your mind the entire time. Psychologists call this prospective cognition, the ability to mentally project yourself into a future moment and work backwards from it. It's the same mental machinery you use when you plan a trip, set a savings goal, or keep a promise to someone 3 weeks in advance. No other animal does this with material objects. A chimpanzee will use a stick to get ants out of a hole, but it won't look at a stick and visualize carving it into a tool it might need next week. The time horizon isn't there. When humans started making clothing, they were demonstrating physically, materially, that they had developed this capacity. Clothing isn't just fabric, it's evidence of a mind that can think forward in time, but that's still not the deepest layer. There's a concept in psychology called theory of mind. It sounds technical, but it's actually quite simple. Theory of mind is the ability to understand that other people have inner lives, thoughts, feelings, judgments, that are separate from your own. It's the ability to step outside yourself and ask, what is this situation looking like from where they're standing? Most animals don't have this, not in any meaningful form. A dog reacts to your energy. A crow can solve problems, but neither of them sits there wondering what you think of them. Humans do, and at some point in our evolution, we don't know exactly when, but the evidence suggests it correlates with the behavioral changes around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. This ability developed at an unprecedented depth. We didn't just begin to understand that other people had thoughts. We began to feel the weight of being perceived by them. That sensation, the awareness that your body exists in other people's minds as an image they are constantly evaluating, is what neuroscientists and psychologists now recognize as the foundational experience behind self-consciousness, behind social anxiety, behind the way your posture straightens slightly when someone enters the room. It's also, almost certainly, what drove early humans to start covering themselves. This wasn't shame in the moralistic sense. It wasn't guilt. It was something more primal and more interesting. The sudden, visceral awareness that you are visible, that your body is being read by the people around you, that the way you appear tells a story about who you are, whether you intend it to or not. And once a brain becomes capable of feeling that, once it develops the circuitry to experience being seen, covering certain parts of the body becomes instinctive. Not because those parts are cold, because they are exposed. What happened next is where this story gets genuinely fascinating. Once humans understood, even at an unconscious biological level, that appearance communicated something, clothing stopped being passive protection and became active communication. Researchers studying pre-agricultural societies across isolated continents found something consistent that shouldn't be possible if clothing were purely functional. Even in equatorial climates, even in environments where temperature was never a threat, humans still adorned themselves. Feathers, beads carved from bone, painted bark, shells strung on fiber. In some cases, these decorations required enormous effort to obtain and craft, hours of labor for something that served no survival function at all. Except it did serve a function. Just a social one, because as human groups grew larger, moving from small family clusters to extended tribes to complex societies where you regularly encountered strangers, you needed a way to communicate critical information instantly. Before you spoke, before you knew someone's name, clothing became the answer. The material someone wore told you what group they belonged to, their social rank, their role, hunter, elder, healer, leader, whether they were returning from war or preparing for ceremony, whether they were eligible for partnership, whether they were dangerous. In environments where misreading a stranger could cost you your life, these visual signals weren't decorative luxuries. They were survival technology, a system of instant meaning that every member of the group could read fluently. Clothing was, from very early on, a language, one of the oldest and most universal humans ever developed. And like all languages, it evolved rapidly once it started. What began as hide and fiber became linen, wool, silk. Patterns became symbols. Colors became status markers. Cuts and silhouettes mapped onto identity groups that spanned continents. The runway shows in Paris and Lagos today are, at their structural core, doing what early humans did around fires in the African savannah, negotiating meaning through appearance. Let's make this personal. You got dressed today. Maybe it took you 30 seconds. Maybe you agonized over it. Either way, you made choices. Some of them were conscious, a lot of them weren't. But here's what was actually happening in your brain as you did it. You were running a deeply ancient social calculation. You were processing the upcoming environment, where you're going, who will be there, what those people expect, what version of yourself you want to present, and translating that processing into fabric and color and fit. You were managing perception. Consciously or not, you were choosing how to be seen. That low-level anxiety you feel when you realize you're overdressed or underdressed for something, too formal, too casual, wrong crowd, wrong context, isn't vanity. It's your social cognition firing accurately. Your brain detecting a mismatch between the signal you're sending and the context you're in. It's a system that evolved over tens of thousands of years specifically to catch those mismatches before they became social mistakes. That system once told people whether a stranger across the clearing was friend or threat. Now it tells you whether your outfit works for a second date. The mechanism is identical, only the stakes have changed. Here's what the science actually points to when you stand back and look at all of it together. Clothing didn't begin because humans were clever enough to solve a cold weather problem. The evidence doesn't support that sequence. Clothing began because human consciousness reached a threshold, a level of self-awareness and social perception that made the experience of being unclothed in front of other people feel fundamentally different than it had before. We became, at some point, aware of ourselves as beings who are observed, creatures who exist not just in our own experience, but in the minds of everyone around us. And once that awareness switched on, the body became something that needed to be managed, curated, communicated through. Clothing was the first tool for that, not a tool for the environment, a tool for navigating other people. And in that sense, every garment ever made, from the animal hide of 170,000 years ago to whatever you're wearing right now, is an artifact of the same underlying experience. The experience of being human in a world full of other humans who are watching. We are, perhaps more than anything else, creatures who are acutely aware of being seen. And clothing is what we built in response to that awareness. Tomorrow morning, you'll do what you always do. You'll open a drawer or a wardrobe, pull something out, and put it on. It'll probably feel automatic, routine, barely worth thinking about. But somewhere under that routine, a very old piece of your brain will be doing what it was designed to do. Calculating, signaling, choosing a version of you to show the world. Not because you're cold, because you became conscious, and that changes everything.